Welcome back as we start our next lesson in New Testament Greek. We're coming this time, as you know, to chapter 19. Chapter 19 continues the discussion that we began last time, in which we were dealing with participles. You'll recall, and you should be fairly conversant with the idea now, that participles are verbal adjectives. They are a way of using verbs to modify or describe in some particular aspect a noun. We talk about a good man, a fat man, a handsome man, or a running man, or a reading man, you see, and in that case we're using the verb as a descriptor to apply to the man. Well, the participles that we've studied so far are called present participles, and in Greek, a present participle is referring to an adjectival modifier that describes action happening at the time of the leading verb. You know that every sentence has to have a verb. It has to indicate something is happening, some kind of action. And if the modifier is applying to action that's taking place concurrently with the action that's referred to in the leading verb, then that's the way the Greek will use the present participle. It may, of course, be necessary on occasion to refer to another time frame. So I could talk about the man while he is walking down the street, or I could refer to the man having walked down the street, you see, does something else. And so in that case, I'm referring to action. I'm still describing the man, but in that case, I'm referring to action that's taking place prior to the time of the leading verb. In Greek, idiomatically, the way that that is accomplished is through the use of the aorist participle. And so in this chapter, that's what we're dealing with. We're coming to the aorist participle. You're going to notice that the endings are quite similar to the endings that we already have learned. The only real difference is that we have throughout, for the most part, the sign of the aorist, which you'll recall is the sigma alpha configuration. So as you look at these aorist participle words, you're going to notice that you'll find that sigma alpha showing up, but otherwise the endings are pretty similar to what you've already learned. So there's not going to be a whole lot of new memorization here, but it will give you a chance to continue to master the memorization that you've already done with respect to participles from chapter 18. The other idea that we're going to be introduced to in this chapter is second aorist participles. Now you'll notice that the aorist has both a first and second aorist. We've already studied that. You should be pretty comfortable with that at this point. So of course I can use the word lambano, which means I take, but if I use the aorist, it's going to go to what's called the second aorist, elaban. And in that case, you'll recall that the endings that are connected to the second aorist stem are actually the endings that we learned in the imperfect tense. Well, something like that is going to take place with the aorist participle. We're going to use a different stem, and then the stem is going to have attached to it endings that actually you associate with the present participle. And so it's not really too difficult. Again, there's no new endings that you're going to have to learn. You just have to remember that if you make the adjustment in the stem, then the endings go back to the present participle, whereas if it's the characteristic change in the stem of a sigma alpha, then you're going to use the aorist participle endings. So again, there's not a whole lot here that's too confusing. The main problem is just making sure that you're getting pretty comfortable with these endings and able to, without too much effort, be able to associate the ending with the stem and get the sense that's implied in the particular word that's being used. That's the bulk of what's going on in this chapter. We're going to find that aorist participles can have the same kinds of uses that we found in the present participle. That is, we can have the attributive use where the article comes immediately before the participle. And so I could say the walking down the street man, but in the aorist it would be the having walked down the street man. Idiomatically, that's the way the Greek would think of it. Of course, when we translate that into English, we're going to say something like the man who had walked down the street, or something like that. You want to make the English more or less pleasing to the English ear. But before you do that, before you even worry about making the sound pleasing to the English ear, you want to think like a Greek. And the way you think like a Greek is really the way I was putting it in the first place. The having walked down the street man, that kind of thing. That would be more the syntax that the Greek has in mind. We can also have the substantive use of the participle in the aorist as well. So I could say the having walked down the street ones, you see. And if I don't have any other noun that's associated with that participle, then just letting it sit there in that kind of unfinished sort of formation, then I'm going to supply some kind of word. I'm going to imply it into the sentence, and it would be something like men or them. In other words, person, something that would be more or less nondescript but would fill out the meaning. The Greek, of course, doesn't do that, but again, to make good English, we have to supply that kind of information. So that's the basics of what's going on. So we're going to look first of all at the vocabulary list, and you'll notice that for the most part the vocabulary words that we look at here are words you've already had. All we're going to be learning is that there is a different stem that goes with the second aorist participle, and so really you're just adding to information that you already have at your disposal. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll take a look at the vocabulary list first of all. So the vocabulary list is actually fairly short, and you'll notice most of these words are words that you've already had. We have first of all egagon. I should pronounce it egagon because the accent, as you'll see, is on the ultima here. Not surprisingly, this is from the verb that you've already learned, the word ago. This is the second aorist participle. And so notice what we have here. The omega nu, of course, is an ending that we already mastered in connection with the present participle. We happen to know that this is going to be, however, aorist because we have this second aorist stem. So the endings are going to be the same endings that you learned with the present participle, but because we're attaching them to the second aorist participle stem, it's going to have that sense of a aorist participle. Having led would be the way you typically translate that. Notice that the augment is missing. The only time we have an augment is when we're in the indicative mood. And at this point, of course, we've sallied forth away from the indicative mood. Participles are not in the indicative, and so the augment disappears. And so throughout, you're going to find that the augment is not present, and we simply revert back to the alpha, which we would have had in the first place. Here we have a new word. This is the word apethenon. This is the second aorist of apothnesko. We've already had apothnesko, which is, of course, the word for I die. This is the aorist, and you'll notice that it has the second aorist endings here, which are identical to the imperfect endings. We do, of course, have the augment, which follows the prefix and precedes the stem. Because this is in the indicative mood, it's simply the imperfect tense. So apethenon, I died. The third word we have is apokrythane. Apokrythane is from a word that we've already had, apokrinomai, a deponent verb, which means I answer. This is the past tense of this, the aorist tense. It's also deponent, and this is passive in form, but of course active in meaning. Again, the augment is present because we're still in the indicative mood. This is the aorist passive form, but active meaning, and it simply means I answered. The next word that we have here is apone. Notice that apone is the aorist participle. It's second aorist, and so once again we have this ending that looks like the same endings that we had in the present participle. The augment actually appears to be present. There's a somewhat technical explanation for that I'm not going to bother you with, but simply notice, it's kind of irregular, but notice that we have apone, and it's quite similar to apone, the word that meant I said, but this would be translated having said. I neglected to mention when we were up here, and you'll notice it here as well, that the accent unexpectedly is on the ultima. That is because in the second aorist participle, the accent is irregular. It's going to land here on the ultima and remain there throughout the conjugation. So as we take a look at it, we'll notice that as well. Here we have elthone. This is the word from erkomai. It's going to mean having gone or having come from erkomai. Again, you'll notice that here we do not have the augment. Normally, aelthone would have an eta, but here it's an epsilon. Notice again the accent is on the ultima. And so otherwise it's similar to the other aorist participles we've looked at. Here we have anegkone. Anegkone is, of course, from pharaoh. We've already had anegka. This is second aorist, and so it's going to have the second aorist endings, which actually look like the first aorist, but because it's a second aorist stem, it has those endings. So anegkone is having borne or having brought. And finally, idone. From adone, we had I saw. This is having seen. Again, it's the second aorist stem with the second aorist participle endings. And again, they look like the present participle endings. So you'll see a little bit of a mix of words we've added. Actually, as it turns out, every one of these are certain forms of words we've had before. And so nothing really new here, except we're just simply extending our understanding of how these particular words are going to be formed. Let's just take a look for a moment at the endings that we're going to have in this second aorist participle arrangement. Again, what I want you to know is basically these are the same endings we've already learned. We're simply now using them in connection with this sigma alpha. So the ordinary, regular configuration of the second aorist participle is going to be a sigma alpha with the same endings that you learned in the present participle. So lusas, lusantos, lusanti, lusanta. That should all sound somewhat familiar to you. If we go over to the feminine side, lusasan, again we have the sigma alpha, lusases, lusase, lusasan. This is, of course, typical of the first declension. We find that applies also in the aorist participle. When we come to the neuter, it's going to be lusan. You'll, of course, deduce that the alpha here is short, and that's why this upsilon has a circumflex on it, because when you have a accented penult with a short ultima, then you're going to have a circumflex if the penult happens to be long. Here we have lusantos, lusanti, lusan. And so once again, very similar to what we've already learned. The only difference is that in each case we have the sigma alpha. If we move down to the plural side, again, no surprises. Lusantes, lusantone, lusasen, lusantas. This is a short alpha, so we can keep the accent there pursuant to the recessive rule. In the feminine side, we have lusasai, lusason, rule 51 kicks in there, lusasais, lusasas. And so again, these endings are fairly similar to what we've learned, and the rules of accent apply in a predictable fashion. The sigma alpha is the sign of the aorist, so I hope that doesn't strike you as too overwhelming. Finally, when we look at the neuter plural, lusanta, lusantone, lusasen, lusanta. Again, no surprises, and again, the endings are similar to what we've already learned. When we come to the aorist middle, we find these are endings that should strike you as fairly familiar. Lusamenos, lusamenu, lusameno, lusamenon. In the masculine middle, here we have the feminine middle, lusamene, lusamenes, lusamene, lusamenein. No surprises. Lusamenon, lusamenu, lusameno, lusamenon in the neuter. These are the middle, not the passive, understand. The aorist passive participle is based on the aorist passive stem. And we're going to save that for the next chapter, chapter 20. So all three of these chapters, actually, chapters 18, 19, and 20, deal with the participle. And we're going to look at the aorist passive participle separately. So this is the middle. Obviously, we don't use the middle meaning all that frequently, but we do need these endings because sometimes deponent verbs, like decomai, for example, are going to make use of these endings. And so we want to make sure we have them under control. On the plural side, lusamenoi, lusamenon, lusamenois, lusamenus. In the feminine, lusamenai, lusamenon, lusamenice, lusamenas. And here we have in the neuter, lusamena, lusamenon, lusamenois, lusamena. Once again, the ending's quite similar to what we've already learned. I'm just mentioning these to you to make sure that you recognize the similarity and don't simply look at the list and think, wow, that's an awful lot of stuff to learn, because basically you've already learned it, so it should seem pretty familiar to you. All right, let's take a look at the second aorist participle. And again, I'm just noticing a couple of things here to have you keep in mind. One is that, as we've already mentioned, in the second aorist participle, we're using the present participle endings, and you've already learned them, so there's nothing here to be too concerned about. Idon, idontos, idonti, idonta, idusa, and so on. The stem is the second aorist stem, and so that's how you notice that it is the aorist, and then the present participle endings are attached throughout. The other little oddity about the aorist participle, the second aorist participle, is you notice that the accent is on the ultima. Normally the recessive rule wants the accent to be as far back in the verb as we can move it, but there is an exception here. And in fact, because the participle is sort of a noun as well as a verb, we have an application more of the retentive rule, in which the accent is going to continue to abide where we found it. So idon, idontos, idonti, idonta, so on throughout. This is a short alpha, so that becomes a circumflex. But notice that the accent remains there in the same position that we found it throughout. The only exception is right here, Rule 51, which dictates that in the genitive plural of the first declension, you'll have a circumflex on the ultima, and that rule does apply in this case as well, and so that's the application of the rule in this case. Otherwise, the accent stays on this syllable, and that's pretty much predictable throughout the aorist participle. We're using the aorist participle stem with the present participle endings. I'd like to go ahead and take a look at the examples that Machen gives us in this chapter. I think when we're dealing with participles, it doesn't hurt to make sure we really have these under control. So let's just notice this. The first example that he gives is ho apostolos epon tauta in to hiero blepe ton kurion. Well, some of this is pretty easy. Ho apostolos, of course you recognize that, the apostle. Here we have now, notice, the second aorist participle. That's the second aorist participle stem that we saw in the vocabulary with this ending, which we learned with the present participle, but shows up here in the second aorist participle. And the way to typically render these, probably the easiest way to at least get your brain wrapped around it, is to use the word having. So I'm going to do it that way. The apostle having said tauta, these things, in to hiero, in the temple, blepe, sees the Lord. And notice the most important thing we're going to pay attention to is that the epon, having said, is referring to action that's taking place prior to the time of the leading verb. So the leading verb is in the present tense, sees the Lord, and the epon here is referring to action that precedes the action of the leading verb. So the apostle, having said these things, sees the Lord. Let's take a look at a similar exercise. Here we have epon, and again I'm just going to use my little nifty formula, having said tauta, these things, apeothon, he went away. This is from aperkamai, recall, apeothon, second aorist, so he went away. But notice this is the aorist, and so I want the action of the participle to precede action that was already in the past tense. I can still put it this way, having said these things, he went away, or you could render it, as Machen suggests, after he had said these things, he went away, which would be perfectly acceptable as well. And now Machen gives us a very similar sentence, simply to illustrate the difference between the aorist and the present. Having said these things, he goes away. So you notice you can render it pretty much the same. Having said these things, he went away. or having said these things, he goes away, and you may want to massage the English a bit just to make it more comfortable in terms of the translation, but that pretty much captures the idea. And then the final exercise, or the final example that we're going to look at on this page, pros eilthon, from pros erchomai, I come to. So this is going to be pros eilthon, I came to, and then of course auto in the dative, I came to him. And then eponti, notice the dative ending here is therefore going to associate to this dative pronoun. I came to him having said these things. Well, it's ambiguous if you leave it that way. I came to him having said these things. We don't know if it's I who had said these things or him. And so again, when you do your English translation, you want to make that clear. I came to him after he had said these things would be a correct expression of the true sense of that sentence. Here's an example where the leading verb is actually in the future. So opsomatha, you know, means we shall see. Auton, him. Here's an aorist participle. It only is necessary to show that it refers to action prior to the leading verb, which happens to be in the future. So eilthontes, second aorist from erchomai, having come, pros ton kyrion, to the Lord, we shall see him. You might put it, when we have come to the Lord, we shall see him. Anything that conveys the idea that this coming to the Lord, referring of course to us, because the we is the subject of the sentence, is going to be referring to action prior to the time of the leading verb. Here's an example that uses the attributive form of the aorist participle. So we have ho mathetes, the disciple, ho akousos, the having heard. Notice that the sos here is the nominative masculine singular, and obviously is going to be associated with mathetes. So the disciple, the having heard, tauta, these things, in to hiero, in the temple. Eilthen, came, of course the ending here in the second aorist verb, came, eis ton oikon, into the house. The disciple, having heard these things in the temple, came into the house. Or, when the disciple had heard these things in the temple, he came into the house. That would be a little bit more of an acceptable English rendering. But before you get there, you want to stay pretty close to the literal Greek reading. The disciple, the having heard these things in the temple, came into the house. And then how about this one, which uses the attributive position and also the substantive use. So literally it's ho, the having heard these things, no, a noun in the sentence to associate it with. So the having heard these things one, or because it's masculine, we could say the having heard these things man, apeilthen, went away. Notice that the having heard one is actually the subject of the sentence, and therefore is the subject that's going to be associated with this third person singular ending of the second aorist verb aperkamai. So the having heard these things man went away. But we could put it again in better English. After he had heard these things, he went away, you see, and that would be acceptable English for a rendering of that Greek sentence. Then how about this one? Edon, I saw, tous, epontas, I saw the, having said, these things, ones. So again, we have the attributive use with the substantive. In this case, the substantive happens to be in the direct object arrangement, so it's in the accusative. I saw the having said these things one. Or I could say, I saw those who had said these things. Or because it's masculine, I could say, I saw the men who had said these things. The context would help you determine what's the most appropriate rendering. So, you feeling fairly comfortable with that? Let's go ahead and do some of the exercises. We'll do the first three, as is our custom. So the first one we have here, this is from the translation exercises in Machen. We have labontes, tauta para, ton, pistuanton, eis ton kyrion, ex eilthamen eis tein erimon. So, well, I notice first of all I have lab, and I have mastered at this point the idea that elabon was the second aorist of lambano. My old friend is here once again, the second aorist, but now it has a participle ending. I know that lambano means receive or take, so just for openers, I'm going to render this having received. I notice that it's the nominative plural, so I know it's going to be associated with the subject, a plural subject, in this sentence, and just by way of passing, I notice the leading verb is indeed the first person plural, so it's going to be a we that is the subject of the sentence as we go along. So having received tauta, these things, para with the genitive, from the, and then pistuanton, the believing. Notice this is a present participle now, so it indicates action happening at the time of the leading verb. So having received these things from the believing in the Lord ones, we went out, exerchomai, this is exelthomen, we went out into the desert. So having received these things from those who were believing, you see, action indicating the time of the leading verb, having received these things from the believing, or those who were believing in the Lord, we went out into the desert. Does that make sense? This is a good exercise because it gives us both the aorist participle and a present participle, and we're forced in our translation to accommodate both of those in a meaningful way in our translation. If we drop down to the second of the exercises, pistai, asin, hai, dexamenai, tus, diokomenus, hupo, tu, archontos. Well, pistai, of course I know the word pistos, which means faithful. This is the feminine plural nominative, so faithful, it's going to be referring to something that's in the subject of this sentence, faithful. Asin, are. Notice, of course, we have an enclitic, and when you have a word that has an acute on the ultima, the acute remains acute, and there's no accent on the enclitic, so pistai, faithful are, and then notice here, this is the predicate nominative. It's also nominative, of course, and feminine, and so I need to insert the idea of women into this. Faithful are the women, and it is referring to those who receive. The having received, notice that here we have, of course, a deponent, so we have these middle endings. This is an aorist stem, and so the having received, the being persecuted. Notice this is a present participle now, so it's the having received, the being persecuted by the ruler ones. Literally then, faithful are the women, that is the having received, the being persecuted by the ruler women. Faithful are the women who received those who were being persecuted, or are being persecuted, I should say, by the women, because this asin is in the present tense. So again, we're combining an aorist participle here with a present participle here, and need to accommodate both of those in our translation. All right, we come to the third of our exercises, and this one again is fairly straightforward. We're going to have edomen. This is the second aorist of blepo. We saw. Autus, personal pronoun, accusative, plural, masculine. We saw them. I have a kai, and of course I'm suspicious that this will be a both and situation, so that's what I'm going to assume. We saw them both. Notice that meno, I remain, is combined with a present participle ending, so I saw them both remaining. Menontas is, of course, the accusative plural, it's going to go with autus. So it's we saw them both remaining in to oiko, in the house, kai, exalthontas. Oh, now I've got, you see, an aorist with this second aorist ending. And notice it's identical here to this ending, but the difference here is that it's on a second aorist stem. So it means having gone out or having exited. So it's both remaining in the house and having gone out, exautu, of it. Autu, of course, referring to the house. So we saw them both while they were remaining in the house and after they had gone out of it, if you want to put it in decent English, but I hope you get the basic sense of the more literal reading. That's what you want to do as you're looking at a sentence like that. All right, now changing our focus here to the composition exercises, we'll look at the first three of these. In Machen it reads, "Those who have not seen the apostle do not know him." So again, I want to get my mind into the way a Greek would think about that. Those who have not seen the apostle is going to be the not second aorist with the ending that goes with it. The having not seen, notice that's the subject of the sentence. So the having not seen the apostle ones, and it's rendered in Machen, those who have not seen the apostle, but again, you want to get a more kind of literal sense of how the Greek thinks about it. The not having seen the apostle ones, not genoskusen, third person plural present of genosko, do not know him. So those who have not seen the apostle, aorist participle, do not know him, denoting action taking place prior to the time of the leading verb. And that's pretty straightforward. I hope you were able to come up with something about like that. Our second exercise reads, "I did not see him who had believed on the Lord." I did not see him who had believed on the Lord. So again, I've got uk, because it's in the indicative, uk edon, I did not see. Second aorist, of course, would be familiar to you. I did not see the pistusanta, having believed, aston kyrion one. I did not see the having believed in the Lord one, would be the way the Greek would think through the sentence here. And of course, that's basically the same sense as we have from Machen. I did not see him who had believed on the Lord. And then finally, the last sentence we're going to look at, number 3. I saw him after he had believed on the Lord, but ye saw him while he was still in the kingdom of the evil one. So what shall we do with this? Well, we have edon, I saw him, pistusanta, notice this is the accusative, singular, masculine. So I saw him after he had believed, or having believed, aston kyrion, in the Lord, but, I used Allah here, you could use a form of death, but edita, this is the plural, of course, second person plural, ye, or you, saw, auton, him, eti, yet, here we have the verb of being, onta, again it's in the accusative, masculine, singular, yet being in te basileia, in the kingdom, to poneru, of the evil one. But you saw him yet being in the kingdom of the evil one is about the same as you saw him while he was still in the kingdom of the evil one, you see. This onta is, of course, a present participle indicating that's a situation occurring at the time of the leading verb. You saw him while he was yet in the kingdom of the evil one. Hope that makes sense. The little additional idea here is this verb of being, which is a form of eimi and indicates a state of being at the time of the leading verb. And of course, that's should be a familiar idea to you at this point. So a little longer sentence, but hopefully you were able to come up with something along those lines. And that will do it for our discussion of chapter 19. Again, if you've been working through diligently, this shouldn't be overly difficult to master. The endings are pretty similar to what you already know. The sigma alpha is the sign of the aorist, and when we have the second aorist, of course, we're using stems that have already become familiar to us as well. So overall, I think you're going to find this fairly straightforward. Work through the exercises, compare your answers to the ones that are provided in the answer key. If you have any difficulties along the way, then be sure to think about it, work it out, figure it out. Make sure that you've basically resolved any difficulties that you have. And from there, we'll move on to chapter 20. Chapter 20 will round out our discussion of participles by looking at aorist passive participles, which of course are very important as well. And a couple of other things will come up in that chapter 20 that are quite important as well. So we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, hope God will continue to richly bless your studies, and we'll look forward to our next time together.